All right, welcome back to the deep dive. You know the deal, right? You're here because you want to know what really moves the needle when it comes to your performance, your health, how to feel your best, and do more. And you don't want to have to read through piles of research to get there, so you're letting us do the heavy lifting.
That's right.
Well, today we're diving into something that might make you rethink that water bottle you're always carrying around, especially those of you who really push yourselves out there in endurance sports. You know, we're always told to just chug plain water, right? But we're going to explore a different way to hydrate, maybe even a more effective way, using something you wouldn't expect, something that comes straight from the ocean.
Yeah, it's definitely going to turn some heads.
It is.
Yeah.
So we all know how important it is to stay hydrated. But the source we're looking at today suggests that just drinking plain water might not be the most optimal way to fuel your body, especially when you're talking about intense activity.
Right.
And it got us thinking, maybe we're missing something really crucial that could unlock a whole new level of hydration.
You got it.
So what's this secret weapon? Well, it's diluted seawater.
Mm.
Yeah, I know what you're thinking. Drink seawater. Sounds kind of crazy, right? We've all been told to avoid it like the plague. But that's why we're here today.
Exactly.
In this deep dive, we're going to investigate the potential benefits of very carefully, and I want to emphasize carefully here, of incorporating seawater into your hydration plan, specifically for endurance exercise. And all of this is based on the evidence we have in front of us. So stick with us and let's see if this unconventional approach actually holds water, so to speak, and offers even more than just basic hydration. What do you think?
I am ready to dive in.
All right, let's do it. So one of the things that really jumped out at us from the source is the argument that hydration is, and listen to this, more important than carbohydrate intake when it comes to endurance performance.
You're telling me.
It's huge, right?
It is.
And it makes you pause and think, wait a minute, all this emphasis on carb loading and gels?
Yeah.
But this source says, hold on a second. Let's talk about getting that water where it really needs to be, inside your cells.
Oh.
And that's a really interesting point. It's not just about how much water you're drinking. It's about how much your body can actually use.
Exactly.
And that's where the seawater idea comes in. So tell us, how does adding a bit of the ocean, just a little bit, how does that help with this whole idea of cellular hydration?
It all comes down to the minerals. The source we have here highlights that seawater, believe it or not, has a mineral makeup that's surprisingly similar to our own blood plasma. And these minerals play a crucial role in osmosis, the process of how water moves in and out of our cells.
Okay, osmosis. We've touched on this before in the show, but for our listeners who are tuning in for the first time or just need a quick refresher, let's break down why osmosis is so important here and why the fact that seawater and our blood have similar mineral profiles is such a big deal.
Sure, happy to explain. You can think of the membranes of your cells as these super selective gateways. Water moves across these gateways based on the concentration of stuff that's dissolved in the water on either side. These are things we call solutes, like minerals. Now, when you drink plain water, it has a much lower concentration of these minerals compared to what's inside your cells.
Right.
But when you introduce a small amount of diluted seawater, you're essentially making the mineral concentration of the water you're drinking closer to your body's internal environment. It's like, you're speaking the same language. And as the source puts it, this reduces the mineral difference.
Okay.
And it allows for more efficient absorption of that water into your cells.
Got it. So it's not about overwhelming the system with tons of water. It's about making sure that your cells can actually take it in.
Exactly.
So it's about making that environment a little bit more welcoming.
Okay, so all of this sounds really interesting in theory, but let's get practical. What does this actually look like? How do we actually do this? Like, how much seawater are we talking about adding to our water on a daily basis?
Well, for your everyday hydration, when you're not out there doing a marathon or anything, the source suggests a very small amount. Like we're talking about a splash or roughly 1 to 2% seawater in your regular drinking water. You could think of it as adding a tiny splash to a liter bottle.
Okay, so a very subtle addition.
Yeah, very minimal.
It's really interesting because it kind of makes you wonder why plain water sometimes doesn't feel like enough. And the source kind of touches on this. There's a little bit of pushback against this idea that just drinking plain water isn't always enough. And then you have that other common idea of just adding table salt to your water. So what makes seawater different? Why is it better, potentially, than just sprinkling some sodium chloride in there?
Right. Well, table salt, it's just sodium and chloride.
Yeah.
But with seawater, it's a different story. It's got this whole spectrum of minerals, magnesium, potassium, calcium, and trace elements, all in this naturally balanced mix. And like the source points out, this complex mineral profile is way more similar to what our bodies need compared to just simple sodium chloride.
I see.
So it's kind of like, you've got the full orchestra of minerals instead of just the percussion
I
section.
like that.
And it's that synergy between all these different minerals that likely contributes to that improved hydration.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, what about all those sports drinks we see everywhere? How does this diluted seawater approach stack up against those?
That's a great question. It's important to remember that, especially at those lower daily intake levels, we're not using diluted seawater as a source of carbohydrates like those commercial isotonic drinks. Those are often packed with sugars to give you energy, and they have that specific blend of electrolytes, but they're really geared towards refueling after really tough workouts.
Hmm.
Diluted seawater, especially at that, 1 to 2% we talked about for everyday hydration, is really about optimizing the fundamental way our bodies absorb water. It's not about replacing those glycogen stores or replenishing huge electrolyte losses after a crazy workout.
Okay, so it's more about making your regular hydration more effective rather than being like a recovery drink after you've really pushed it.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's talk about when we should actually be thinking about incorporating seawater into our routine, specifically for endurance training.
Yeah.
When does the source recommend doing this?
Well, they suggest considering it before, during, and even after your workouts, but they really put a big emphasis on that pre-training window, especially if you're someone who works out in a fasted state or if you're on a low carbohydrate diet.
So pre-training, particularly in those low-carb or fasted states, why is that so important?
Okay, so let's back up a bit. When you're training in a carb-depleted state, your body starts relying on different energy pathways,
Mhm.
and this can lead to, you actually lose more minerals this way. So by giving your body some mineral-rich water before you even start exercising, you're essentially setting your cells up for success.
Yeah.
You're giving them what they need
Yeah.
and potentially helping them produce energy more efficiently right from the get-go.
It's like prepping the engine for better performance.
Exacts.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about those longer workouts, those real endurance pushes, and then the recovery phase afterwards? What does the source say about that?
So during those really long or intense efforts where you're sweating a lot, they suggest sipping on diluted seawater throughout. And for recovery, they offer a few different options. You could add it to a smoothie,
Okay,
or you could just be mindful about eating foods that are naturally salty
makes sense.
to help replace those lost minerals. This can be a good alternative to just drinking more diluted seawater if that's not appealing to you.
Yeah, so some flexibility in how you approach it.
Okay.
Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty of the numbers here. For hydrating during exercise, the source actually gives us some specific amounts to aim for, right?
Yeah, they recommend that you try to have about 20 to 25% seawater in your total fluid intake while you're training. So let's say you plan on drinking, I don't know, maybe like 700 milliliters over an hour of exercise.
Okay.
About 140 to 175 milliliters of that could be seawater.
Okay, so that's a pretty big jump from that 1 to 2% we talked about for daily hydration.
It is, it is.
And there's an upper limit too, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Like a point where you don't want to go beyond.
Absolutely. The source is very clear about not going over 30%. If you drink more than that, it can actually backfire and lead to digestive issues like diarrhea.
And that would definitely defeat the purpose of trying to stay hydrated.
For sure. You'd be trading one form of water loss for another.
Exactly. And this brings up a common concern people have. We're told not to drink seawater because it dehydrates you.
Right, right.
So can you clear up how this diluted seawater approach is different?
Yeah, that's super important to understand. Undiluted seawater, it's got way more salt than your body fluids. So if you drink pure seawater, your body's actually going to pull water out of your cells to try and balance things out, and that's what leads to dehydration. But when you dilute seawater properly, with fresh water, to those concentrations we've been talking about, especially that 20 to 25% range during exercise, it's a whole different ballgame. The mineral balance actually helps your cells absorb water better.
Okay.
So dilution is key here. It makes all the difference.
It's a really important distinction. Now, I know a lot of our listeners, the endurance athletes out there, they've experienced that awful sloshing feeling in their stomach when they're trying to drink enough during exercise.
Oh, yeah.
So how does this seawater approach play into that?
The source recommends taking it slow Instead of chugging a ton of diluted seawater, start with small sips, see how your body feels. Maybe try a small glass with a bit of seawater before and after training as a starting point, and just pay attention to how you feel.
It's about listening to your body
Exactly.
and finding what works for you. Now, is this something you need to do for every single workout? Is it only when you're sweating buckets or just in the heat of summer? When is this really necessary?
Well, the source suggests that even a little bit of mineral replenishment is helpful, even if you're not sweating a ton. Like what happens overnight. They even suggest having a little mineral-rich water first thing in the morning. But obviously, the hotter it is, the more you sweat, the more important it becomes.
Okay, so probably more critical in those tough conditions, but potentially helpful even on those easier days.
That's the idea.
Okay, last question. How does seawater compare to those electrolyte powders that are so popular with athletes?
Right, those are everywhere. Well, the source points out that the mineral content of those powders can really vary from brand to brand.
Mm-hmm.
And while they can definitely be a convenient way to get electrolytes, the author of the source we're looking at, they actually prefer natural seawater, assuming it's clean and filtered.
Yeah.
Their reasoning is that it provides a really well-balanced mix of minerals in proportions that work well with our bodies.
So it's a more natural approach, kind of like a whole food approach to electrolytes compared to those manufactured blends.
Exactly. Exactly. And if you have access to clean seawater, it's a very readily available and pretty affordable option.
That's a good point. So to sum it all up, what we've learned for this deep dive is that by incorporating small amounts of diluted seawater very carefully into our hydration strategy, especially when we're training for endurance events, we might actually be able to hydrate ourselves more effectively. And it's all thanks to that natural mineral profile that seawater provides.
Yeah, that's the gist of it. And the key is to start slow, experiment a little bit, and really listen to what your body's telling you. There's no one-size-fits-all solution here.
It's about finding those little adjustments that can make a big difference in how your body handles fluids during exercise. And that brings us to our final thought for you today. Thinking about this whole seawater thing, it really makes you question everything you thought you knew about sports drinks and how to hydrate properly, and it encourages us to look for those more natural solutions, maybe even solutions that seem surprising at first.
Yeah, for sure.
So we want you to think about this. What other aspects of our health and performance might have more natural, more subtle solutions just waiting to be discovered? Maybe those solutions are right under our noses. We really encourage you to dig a little deeper into seawater and how it could impact your overall well-being and not just your athletic performance.
It's fascinating stuff.
It is. It really makes you think about the power of nature and how connected we are to it. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder that. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. Until next time.
See you later.